My husband's agent sold his unfinished novel to a ghostwriter under a stranger's name. 8 months after my husband died, I found his last novel on a bookstore shelf with another man's name on the cover, and the woman who'd represented him for 11 years was the one who'd sold it. My husband Anders wrote the kind of quiet, patient literary fiction that never made bestseller lists, but earned him a small, devoted readership, and more importantly to him, the respect of writers he actually admired. He published 4 novels over 16 years, each one taking longer than the last. Each one revised so many times, he used to joke that his real career was rewriting the same 3 sentences until they stopped embarrassing him. His agent, Cordelia Marsh, had represented him since his very first manuscript, back when he was working nights at a print shop to pay rent and mailing out submissions from a shared apartment in a city he could barely afford. She sold that first book for almost nothing, stuck with him through 2 novels that underperformed badly enough to worry any less patient agent, and eventually shepherded his 3rd book to the kind of modest critical success that let him quit the print shop for good. He trusted her completely, the way you trust someone who believed in you before you'd given anyone much reason to. I met Anders the year his 2nd novel came out, at a small reading in a bookstore that's since closed, and what I remember most from that night isn't anything he said from the podium, but the way he thanked Cordelia by name in his opening remarks, unprompted, before he'd read a single page, said publicly that he wouldn't have a career at all without her stubborn insistence that his work mattered even when almost nobody else was buying it. I came to know her over the following years the way you come to know your spouse's oldest professional relationships. Dinners a few times a year, a Christmas card exchange, the specific warmth she always had toward Anders that read, to me at the time, as genuine investment in a writer she'd believed in from the very beginning. Anders was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 11 months before he died, and the last real project he had the strength to work on was the 5th novel he'd been circling for almost 3 years, a book about a lighthouse keeper's daughter that he considered, privately, the best thing he'd ever attempted. He didn't finish it. He got close enough that he'd sent Cordelia a full draft of the first 2/3 and detailed notes on where the rest was headed. Close enough that in his last lucid weeks he talked about it more than almost anything else, worried aloud more than once about what would happen to it if he ran out of time. Cordelia visited him twice in those final months, sat by his bed, told him, in front of me, that she would make sure the book was taken care of, whatever that ended up meaning, that his legacy mattered to her as much as it mattered to him. I believed her completely. I want that on the record, the same way it's mattered in every version of a story like this one. This isn't an account of someone who was cold from the start and finally showed it. Cordelia cried at his funeral. She gave one of the eulogies, a genuinely moving one, about discovering his first manuscript in a slush pile and knowing within 10 pages that she'd found a writer worth building a career around. I hugged her afterward and thanked her for everything she'd done for him, and I meant it. The literary estate side of things, in the months after, moved slower than I expected, but not in a way that raised any alarm at the time. Cordelia explained patiently, over a series of phone calls I was too exhausted with grief to fully absorb, that the unfinished manuscript presented complicated questions, whether it could ethically or legally be published at all in its incomplete state, whether a completion by another writer was even something Anders would have wanted, whether the estate might be better served simply preserving the draft as it stood, rather than risking a rushed, compromised version reaching readers. I told her I trusted her judgment on all of it. I had a great deal else to manage that year. The funeral costs, the house, a grief I still don't fully have language for even now, and the unfinished novel, as much as it broke my heart to think about, felt like exactly the kind of decision I was grateful to hand to someone who'd known and loved his work longer than I had. 8 months after the funeral, I was in an unrelated bookstore in another city, visiting my sister, browsing the new fiction table the way I still did out of habit even though it hurt more often than it helped, and I saw a cover that stopped me cold in the middle of the aisle. A lighthouse, rendered in the same spare, moody style Anders's other covers had used. A title I recognized instantly, because he'd said it out loud to me more times than I could count in his last months, turning it over, testing whether it still felt right. The Keeper's Daughter. Author name on the cover, a writer I'd never heard of, someone named Thaddeus Fenimore. I picked it up with hands that had gone strangely numb, and read the first page standing in that aisle, and it was Anders's sentences, not similar to his sentences. His actual sentences, the ones from the draft he'd sent Cordelia, rearranged here and there, padded out with new material in a voice that tried to imitate his and mostly failed, but unmistakably, word for word in long stretches, his. I bought the book with shaking hands, said something incoherent to the cashier when she asked if I'd found everything I was looking for, and sat in my sister's guest room that night reading the entire thing cover to cover, unable to stop even as it made me feel physically sick. The first 11 chapters were Anders almost in their entirety, sentences I recognized so specifically I could have told you, before I even flipped back to check, which paragraphs he'd rewritten 4 times and which had come to him whole on a first pass, the way certain passages in a writer's work always do if you've lived close enough to their process to notice. The remaining 2/3 of the book, the part he'd never gotten to write, had been completed by this Thaddeus Fenimore in a voice that borrowed Anders's rhythms without ever quite understanding what made them work. Plot decisions that felt rushed and conventional in exactly the ways Anders had spent 3 years working to avoid. There was no mention of Anders anywhere in the book, not in the author's note, which thanked thanked a list of people I didn't recognize for their support during the long journey of writing it, not in the acknowledgments, not on the copyright page, which listed Thaddeus Fenimore as the sole author, sole copyright holder. Full stop. My husband's name did not appear once, in any form, anywhere in a book that was, for its first 11 chapters, indisputably his own writing. I stayed up until nearly 4 in the morning that night in my sister's guest room, going back through the book a second time with a highlighter, marking every sentence I recognized as unmistakably Anders's own. And by the time I finally stopped, entire pages were solid yellow, whole chapters where I couldn't find a single line that read as anyone else's voice. I found myself, at one point, laughing in a way that frightened me a little, a short, bitter sound with nothing funny behind it, because I'd reached the scene near the middle of the book, the lighthouse keeper standing on the widow's walk in a storm that Anders had read aloud to me from his laptop on one of his last good nights, before the pain got bad enough that reading aloud stopped being something he could manage. He'd been so proud of that scene. He'd asked me, half joking, half not, whether I thought it was the best thing he'd ever written. It was sitting there in a stranger's book, nearly word for word, with someone else's name claiming it as his own invention. I called Cordelia the next morning before I'd even had coffee, my voice coming out in a register I barely recognized as my own. She answered on the second ring, and there was a pause before she spoke, just long enough that I understood, even before she said a word, that this wasn't going to be a conversation where she was as surprised as I was. She told me carefully that the estate, meaning, I gathered, herself acting on authority she said had been granted to her verbally by Anders in those final weeks, had made the difficult decision to have the manuscript completed by a professional writer rather than let it go unpublished forever. She said Thaddeus was a talented, respected craftsman who specialized in exactly this kind of literary completion work, that his name had gone on the cover per standard industry practice for this type of project, that Anders's contribution had been honored through what she called a private acknowledgement arrangement that hadn't made it into the final printed edition, due to a production oversight she was already looking into. I asked her, my voice shaking, whether Anders had actually agreed to any of this, to his name being left off entirely, to another writer taking sole authorship and sole copyright of a book that was, in significant part, his own work. She said the conversations they'd had in his final weeks had been informal, but that she'd understood him to be comfortable with her handling the details however she thought best, given how weak he'd been by then and how much he trusted her judgment. She said she was sorry the acknowledgement hadn't made it into print, that it was an unfortunate error, that she was already in touch with the publisher about correcting it in future printings. Looking back at those 8 months now, there were signs I'd absorbed without really registering, the way grief tends to flatten everything into a single undifferentiated fog where nothing feels unusual because everything already feels wrong. In month 2, Cordelia asked me for a full digital copy of everything on Anders's laptop related to the unfinished manuscript, said it was standard practice to consolidate all drafts and notes in one place for safekeeping, while the estate figured out next steps. I handed it over without hesitation, grateful at the time not to have to look at those files myself. In month 3, she mentioned, in one of our periodic calls, that she'd been in touch with a few trusted people in the industry about how best to honor his legacy, phrased vaguely enough that I never thought to ask for names. In month 4, she stopped returning my calls as promptly as she had at first, blaming a demanding new client roster, and I remember feeling guilty for even noticing the change in her responsiveness, as though my grief didn't entitle me to expect much of anyone's time. In month 5, she sent a brief, warm email letting me know the manuscript question was moving toward a resolution she thought Anders would be proud of, without specifying what that resolution actually was, and I remember reading that sentence 3 or 4 times, comforted by its warmth, never once thinking to ask her to be specific. In month 6, when I brought up gently whether I should expect to see a draft of whatever plan she'd settled on, she told me she'd loop me in once contracts were finalized, that these things moved slowly in publishing, and she didn't want to get my hopes up prematurely. In month 7, nothing at all, no calls, no emails, a silence I filled with the assumption that she was simply respecting my grief by not pushing the subject. It was only in month 8, standing in a bookstore in another city with a stranger's name on my husband's cover, that I understood what that silence had actually been. I didn't sign anything, I told her, once I'd gotten her on the phone that terrible morning. I hadn't been consulted about a completion writer, about a new author name, about a copyright filing that apparently excluded my husband's estate from any legal claim to a book built on his own sentences. Cordelia's tone shifted, just slightly, into something more careful, more measured, the tone I imagined she used with difficult clients rather than grieving widows. She said the literary agency agreement Anders had signed with her years earlier contained broad language authorizing her, as his agent, to make decisions regarding unfinished or unpublished work in the event of his death or incapacity, and that she believed in good faith she'd acted within that authority. She said she understood I was upset, that grief made everything feel more adversarial than it needed to be, and that she hoped we could resolve this amicably, as colleagues who both loved Anders. I hung up the phone and sat on the floor of my sister's guest room for a long time before I could make myself move. I didn't call anyone for 2 full days after that conversation with Cordelia, mostly because I didn't trust myself to speak to another human being without falling apart entirely. My sister Odalie found me on the 3rd morning sitting at her kitchen table with with the book open to the copyright page, just staring at Thaddeus Fenimore's name printed there in plain black type, and she didn't ask me anything at first, just made coffee and sat with me the way she'd been sitting with me through most of that year, present without demanding I explain myself before I was ready. It was Odalie, my actual sister, not the family friend I'd later come to rely on in an entirely different story about my own family's estate mess, a coincidence of names I still find strange every time I think about it, who finally said, gently, that I couldn't fix this with more phone calls to Cordelia, that I needed someone whose entire job was untangling exactly this kind of publishing dispute, someone who wouldn't be swayed by 11 years of history, and a warm voice on the other end of the line the way I still, some shameful part of me had to admit, kept almost being swayed. She found the name through a friend of a friend in the industry, a publishing and intellectual property attorney named Ren Achterberg, who specialized, as it turned out, in exactly the corner of law I hadn't known existed until I needed it. Authorship disputes, estate rights to unfinished creative work, the murky space where an agent's broad authority language runs up against what a dying writer actually did or didn't agree to. I called Ren's office that same afternoon, and she saw me 2 days later, in a small office lined floor to ceiling with case files, and I remember being struck, sitting down across from her, by how different her presence felt from Cordelia's. No warmth performed for my benefit, no careful softening of hard questions, just a direct, unhurried attentiveness that felt, after 8 months of being gently managed, almost shockingly clarifying. She asked me to start from the very beginning, from the day Anders was diagnosed, and she took notes the entire time I talked, occasionally stopping me to ask a clarifying question, never once telling me how I should feel about any of it. I brought Ren everything I had: the copy of the published book, a printed copy of the draft Anders had emailed Cordelia before he died, which I still had in my own inbox because he'd copied me on it almost as an afterthought, wanting a second pair of eyes, and every email exchange between Cordelia and me in the 8 months since the funeral. Ren read through the draft against the published version line by line over the course of a weekend, and when we met again the following week, she'd built a document I still have saved, a side-by-side comparison highlighting exactly which sentences, paragraphs, and in some cases entire pages had been lifted, essentially unchanged, from Anders's draft into the final published book. This isn't a completion in any meaningful sense, Ren told me, sliding the document across the table. A ghostwriter finishing an unfinished manuscript usually means picking up a story and carrying it forward in a new voice, building on someone else's foundation. What happened here is different. Roughly 40% of this published novel is your husband's actual, word-for-word prose, unattributed, with someone else's name claiming full authorship and full copyright over the whole thing. That's not completion. Depending on exactly what authority Cordelia actually had, that's either a serious breach of the agency agreement or it's something closer to fraud. She asked to see the original agency agreement Anders had signed, the one Cordelia kept referencing as her source of authority, and I had to track down a copy through Anders's old files, a document neither of us had looked at closely in years. Ren read it twice, then a third time, circling one clause in particular. The agreement did grant Cordelia authority to represent unpublished or unfinished work in the best interest of the author or the author's estate. Standard boilerplate language meant to cover routine situations like posthumously placing a finished manuscript with a publisher. It said nothing, anywhere, about authorizing a third-party writer to complete unfinished work and receive sole authorship credit. It said nothing about excluding the original author's name from a book built substantially on his own writing. Ren's read was that Cordelia had stretched a clause meant for ordinary posthumous placement into something it was never intended to cover, and that whatever verbal understanding she claimed to have with Anders in his final weeks, assuming it existed at all, which neither of us had any way to verify, almost certainly wouldn't survive scrutiny against the actual written terms of the contract. It was Ren, a few weeks into digging through industry records and publishing databases as part of building the case, who found the detail that changed the shape of everything. She came across a small, mostly overlooked lawsuit from 9 years earlier, settled out of court and never covered by any major outlet, involving a different deceased author and a different unfinished manuscript. The plaintiff's name was Wilhelmina Cho, a poet and novelist who died of complications from a long illness, leaving behind an unfinished literary memoir that had, in remarkably similar fashion, been completed by a ghostwriter and published under a new sole author name a little over a year after her death. The agent representing Wilhelmina Cho's estate in that arrangement, listed by name in the court filing Ren had pulled, was Cordelia Marsh. I read that filing standing in Ren's office with my hand pressed flat against my mouth because the details lined up with an ugliness that felt almost unbearable to absorb all at once. The same broad, boilerplate contract language stretched past its intended meaning, the same pattern of visiting a dying client in their final weeks and later claiming verbal authorization nobody else had witnessed, the same quiet, private acknowledgement promised and then somehow never printed. Wilhelmina Cho's widow, the filing showed, had settled for an undisclosed sum after a year of litigation, with a confidentiality clause attached that had kept the whole arrangement from ever becoming publicly known in a way an ordinary search would have surfaced. Ren tracked down Wilhelmina's widow, a soft-spoken woman named Perpetua Cho, through the attorney who'd represented her in the original case, and Perpetua agreed to speak with us once Ren explained, carefully, literally, what had happened to Anders. Her voice on the phone that first call had the particular flatness of someone who'd told a painful story enough times that the telling itself no longer cost her anything new, though what she described still landed on me like a physical blow. Cordelia had visited Wilhelmina in the hospital during her final weeks, had sat with her the way she'd sat with Anders, had promised in front of witnesses that the unfinished memoir would be handled with care and respect. The finished published version had excluded Wilhelmina's name entirely from the cover and copyright, buried a brief, vague acknowledgement 3 pages into the back matter, and generated, according to Perpetua's own accounting during the litigation, close to $60,000 in advance and royalty payments that Cordelia's agency had collected and never fully passed along to the estate. She's very good at it, Perpetua told us, near the end of that first call. The visiting, the crying at the funeral. I used to think about that a lot afterward, whether any of it was real or whether she's just gotten so practiced at this specific kind of grief that it comes out looking real even when it isn't. I never got an answer to that I was satisfied with. I don't think you will either. But I can tell you this. You're not imagining a pattern. I lived the exact same one, 9 years before you did. Wren's assessment, once Perpetua's account was added to the file, was that we had something far stronger than an isolated contract dispute, a demonstrable pattern of an agent systematically exploiting a specific, narrow window of vulnerability. The weeks when a dying writer was too weak to advocate clearly for themselves, and their surviving family was too consumed by grief to scrutinize what came afterward. That pattern would matter enormously if this went in front of a judge. But Wren, like Rosalind and Pep in stories I'd later hear from other people who'd lived through something structurally similar, was clear-eyed about what a drawn-out lawsuit would actually cost. Years of litigation, depositions that would require me to relive Anders's final weeks under hostile questioning, and the real possibility, given how thoroughly Cordelia had covered herself with confidentiality clauses the first time around, that this case too might quietly settle and disappear rather than ever becoming public. What I wanted, once I sat with it long enough to know my own mind clearly, wasn't primarily the money, though Wren made clear the estate had a strong claim to a significant share of the royalties Cordelia's agency had already collected. What I wanted was for Anders's name to actually appear on the book, his real name, in real print, on future editions, correcting a public record that currently claimed his last novel had been written entirely by a stranger. And I wanted the industry itself, the small, tightly networked world of agents and editors Cordelia still operated within, to know exactly what she'd done, not through a sealed settlement nobody outside a courtroom would ever read, but in a way that made it genuinely difficult for her to do this to a third grieving family someday. Wren's strategy, once we'd settled on that goal, was built around a specific piece of leverage neither Cordelia nor her publisher had any reason to expect. Wren quietly reached out to Thaddeus Fenimore himself, the credited ghostwriter, before ever filing anything formal against Cordelia or the publishing house. It was a calculated risk. Thaddeus could easily have refused to engage at all, could have circled the wagons with Cordelia and the publisher rather than talking to us. But Wren's instinct, based on years of similar cases, was that ghostwriters brought into these arrangements were rarely fully informed of the underlying ethical questions, and were sometimes just as uncomfortable with the final result as anyone, once someone laid out the details plainly. She was right. Thaddeus agreed to a call, cautious and clearly nervous, and told us something neither of us had expected going in, that he'd been told, explicitly, by Cordelia, that Anders's estate had approved the arrangement in full, including the decision to publish under Thaddeus's sole name, and that he'd been shown what he understood to be a signed authorization letter confirming it. He hadn't known, he said, about Wilhelmina Cho, about the earlier lawsuit, about any pattern at all. When Wren sent him the side-by-side comparison document showing exactly how much of the finished novel was Anders's unaltered prose rather than Thaddeus's own completion work, he went quiet on the call for a long moment and then said, plainly, that he hadn't fully realized how little of the finished book was actually his. The signed authorization letter turned out to be the single most useful piece of evidence in the entire case, because once Thaddeus voluntarily produced a copy of it for Wren, a document examiner Wren brought in, a careful, understated man named Basil Renner, who specialized in exactly this kind of authenticity dispute, was able to demonstrate through a comparison against verified samples of Anders's actual signature from medical consent forms and legal documents signed in his final months, that the signature on the authorization letter didn't match. It wasn't a close forgery either. Once Basil laid the samples side by side under magnification, inconsistent pressure, a pen stroke that didn't account for the tremor Anders's own hand had developed by that point in his illness, a signature that looked, if anything, like it had been traced from an earlier, healthier sample rather than produced in the final weeks it was dated to. Wren brought Thaddeus, once he understood the full picture, into the case not as an opposing party, but as a cooperating witness, which changed the entire balance of leverage overnight. Rather than filing a broad lawsuit against the publisher and risking years of delay, Wren sent a detailed demand letter directly to Cordelia and, separately, to the publisher's legal department, laying out the forged authorization, the near-identical pattern from the Wilhelmina Cho case 9 years earlier, Perpetua's willingness to testify to that pattern if it came to litigation, and Basil's forensic signature analysis, all before a single filing had actually actually been made in any court. The publisher's response came back within a week, considerably faster than Wren had expected, and it wasn't the response Cordelia was hoping for. Publishing houses, Wren explained to me afterward, are exquisitely sensitive to exactly this kind of reputational risk. A forged authorization tied to a dead author's unfinished manuscript was precisely the sort of story that could do lasting damage to a house's credibility with other authors and agents if it became public, regardless of how the underlying legal claims ultimately resolved. The publisher's legal team reached out to Wren directly, separately from Cordelia's own attorney, making clear they intended to conduct their own internal review and had no interest in defending an authorization document that appeared on independent forensic review to be forged. Wren spent the 2 days before that meeting preparing me the way I imagined she prepared every client walking into a room with someone who'd once had this much power over their lives, sitting with me at her office late into the evening, running through the questions Cordelia's attorney might raise, coaching me on staying quiet during the parts where my presence mattered more than my words. She told me the goal of the meeting wasn't for me to win an argument in the room. It was to let the evidence do the talking, calmly, methodically, while I simply sat there as the person the evidence was about, present, composed, undeniable. You don't have to convince anyone of anything, she said near the end of our last prep session. You just have to not let her convince you one more time that this was reasonable. The meeting where everything finally came to a head happened not in a courtroom, but in a conference room at the publisher's own offices, at their insistence, with Cordelia, her attorney, the publisher's legal team, Wren, and me all in the same room on a rainy Thursday afternoon almost a year to the day after Anders had died. I hadn't seen Cordelia since the funeral. She looked when she walked in exactly the way I remembered her, composed, warm-eyed, dressed with the same understated elegance she'd always favored. And for one disorienting second, sitting across from her, some old worn groove in my brain still wanted to trust her the way I always had. That feeling didn't survive the first 20 minutes. Wren laid out the case methodically, the same way I imagined she'd done it dozens of times before in cases I'd never hear about. The side-by-side comparison showing Anders's unaltered prose making up nearly half the finished novel, Basil's forensic analysis of the forged authorization signature, and finally, delivered without any dramatic flourish at all, simply as one more fact on the pile, the existence of Wilhelmina Cho's case 9 years earlier, settled quietly, confidentially, and now, Wren made clear, no longer entirely confidential, since Perpetua Cho had agreed to submit a sworn statement describing the pattern in full if this matter proceeded to litigation. I watched something in Cordelia's face give way at that point, a kind of composure cracking that I don't think anyone else in the room could see as clearly as I could, having known her warmth for so many years and understanding now, watching it collapse in real time, exactly how much of it had probably always been performance. Her attorney tried briefly to argue that the earlier settlement was confidential and couldn't be referenced in this proceeding, and Wren pointed out calmly that Perpetua Cho was under no obligation herself, having settled her own claim years earlier, to keep silent about a pattern of behavior currently harming a second family, and that a court would very likely see the earlier case as directly relevant to demonstrating intent, regardless of the confidentiality clause's original scope. It was the publisher's own attorney, not Wren, who asked Cordelia directly, in front of everyone, whether she had personally drafted or arranged for the drafting of the authorization letter bearing Anders's forged signature. Cordelia didn't answer that question directly. She said instead, in a voice that had lost almost all of its earlier warmth, that she had genuinely believed in her heart that this was what Anders would have wanted, his work finished, his story completed, rather than left to gather dust as an incomplete draft nobody would ever read. She said she'd been protecting his legacy the only way she knew how. Nobody in the room, including, I think, her own attorney, found that a satisfying answer to a question about a forged signature. The settlement Wren negotiated over the following weeks accomplished nearly everything I'd asked for at the start. The publisher agreed to reissue the novel with Anders's name added as co-author, properly credited on the cover and copyright page for future printings, with a corrected edition already scheduled. A portion of the original advance and all future royalties would flow to Anders's estate going forward, calculated by an independent industry consultant based on the actual proportion of his unaltered prose in the finished book. Cordelia was dropped by the publisher as an agent for any of their other clients, a consequence that mattered more to her professionally, Wren told me, than almost anything else in the settlement. And word of the case, despite everyone's careful language and lack of formal litigation, moved through the small, tightly networked publishing world exactly the way Wren had predicted it would. Not as headline news, but as the kind of quiet, specific story that agents and editors tell each other at conferences, the kind that ends careers slowly rather than all at once. Thaddeus Fenimore, to his credit, agreed voluntarily to have his own name removed from sole authorship on the corrected edition, listed instead as a contributing writer who completed an unfinished draft, a credit Wren pointed out was both more accurate and, oddly, more dignified than the false claim of full authorship he'd been given in the first place. He wrote me a long, careful letter a few weeks after the settlement was finalized, apologizing for his role in it even though Wren and I both told him more than once that we didn't consider him the primary wrongdoer in any of this. He said finishing someone else's unfinished sentences, once he understood how much of the book had genuinely been Anders's own work rather than his, felt entirely different in retrospect than it had while he was doing it, and that he didn't think he'd ever take on a project like that again, without asking a great many more questions than he had this time. The settlement itself took another 6 weeks to fully finalize after that meeting, longer than Wren had hoped, mostly because Cordelia's attorney kept pushing for narrower language around the corrected edition clause, trying at every turn to limit exactly how prominently Anders's name would appear, and exactly how the story of the correction would be described publicly if anyone ever asked. Wren held firm on every point that mattered to me, gave ground gracefully on details that didn't. The exact font size of the cover credit, for instance, which I genuinely didn't care about, versus the actual copyright registration itself, which I cared about enormously, and which Wren refused to compromise on even slightly. Basil Renner's forensic report ended up attached as an exhibit to the final settlement agreement, a strange, quiet kind of vindication, knowing that somewhere in a filing cabinet at a law firm, a magnified comparison of my dying husband's real signature against a forgery sat as permanent, documented proof of exactly what had been done to him in his final weeks. The corrected edition came out 14 months after the original, a new printing with a cover that looked almost identical to the first except for one line added beneath the title, small but unmistakably there, by Anders Calvite and Thaddeus Fenimore. I bought the very first copy sold at the bookstore near my house, the same kind of small independent shop where Anders had done his very first reading all those years ago, and the owner, who'd known him personally, cried a little handing it to me at the register, and I cried a little too. The two of us standing there over a stack of books neither of us could really explain the weight of to anyone who hadn't lived through the year we'd just had. I read the whole thing again that night, start to finish, the way I had that first terrible night in my sister's guest room, except this time I could actually let myself notice the parts that were genuinely good, rather than reading it purely as evidence. Thaddeus's completion, once I wasn't reading it through the specific horror of realizing my husband's work had been stolen, turned out to be more thoughtful than I'd given it credit for that first time through. Not Anders, never quite Anders, but a careful, respectful attempt to finish a story he'd clearly come to care about, once the fraud underneath it had been stripped away, and what remained was just two writers' work, properly attributed, sitting honestly next to each other on the page. Perpetua Cho came to the small launch event the independent bookstore put together for the corrected edition, flew in from 3 states away without my asking her to, and stood near the back during the reading, with an expression I found impossible to fully read, something between grief for her own long-settled case and something that looked unmistakably like relief, watching a version of her own story finally arrive somewhere different than hers had. Afterward, over coffee, she told me that Wilhelmina's memoir had never gotten a corrected printing of its own, that the settlement she'd accepted years earlier hadn't included that possibility, that she'd made peace, mostly, with her wife's name never appearing properly on the book Wilhelmina had spent the last months of her life writing. She said watching Anders's name go back onto his own cover had done something for her she hadn't expected a stranger's victory to do. It doesn't undo what happened to us, she said, but it means it wasn't for nothing, watching it happen to somebody else and finally being able to say something that mattered. I asked her carefully whether she'd ever consider revisiting her own case, now that Cordelia's pattern was documented and public in a way it hadn't been before. She thought about it for a long time before she answered, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table between us. She said she wasn't sure yet. She said some fights you have the strength for once, and some you only have the strength for on someone else's behalf, and she wasn't certain which category this one fell into for her anymore, all these years later. I told her whatever she decided, I'd help however I could, and I meant it, the same way Wren had meant it reaching out to a stranger's case file 9 years old because a detail in a lawsuit index had refused to sit quietly. Cordelia's name, as far as I know, hasn't appeared on a single published book since the settlement. Wren told me, the last time we spoke, that she'd heard secondhand, through the same industry channels that had carried word of the case in the first place, that Cordelia had left publishing entirely, moved out of state, was reportedly doing some kind of unrelated consulting work now, far from the world of dying writers and unfinished manuscripts and the particular practiced warmth she'd apparently spent a career perfecting for exactly the wrong reasons. I don't know if that's true. I've stopped needing to know, mostly. The same way I've stopped needing an apology I understood a long time ago I was never actually going to get. I keep a copy of both editions now, the original with Thaddeus's name alone on the cover, and the corrected one with Anders's name restored beside it, side by side on the shelf in what used to be his study. Along with the printed draft, he emailed me almost as an afterthought, wanting a second pair of eyes, the one piece of evidence that turned out to matter more than anything else in the entire fight. I don't open that folder often anymore, but I want it there, the whole record, for the day some version of this story needs telling again, not the version where a devoted agent lovingly shepherded a dying man's final book into the world, which is the story that would have stood forever if I hadn't happened to walk down the wrong aisle of a bookstore in another city on an ordinary afternoon, but the true one, where a widow read the first page standing in a store aisle and knew, before she'd even finished the paragraph, that the sentences belonged to someone else.